Logan Taylor wasn't the kind of man who needed recognition to define him. He didn't walk with swagger, didn't boast about medals, and never sought the spotlight even though few deserved it more than him, because Logan was a Navy SEAL, sniper of the highest order, a quiet ghost among warriors, the kind of operator who could disappear into enemy territory for weeks, eliminate threats without ever being seen, and extract hostages from impossible situations. And yet here he was, walking alone down a sleepy stretch of Main Street in Falls Glen, Virginia, dressed in civilian jeans, combat boots, a plain black hoodie, and his well-worn tactical rucksack slung over his shoulder like any other traveler, blending in deliberately, as was his habit during his rare downtimes between deployments, preferring to remain unseen in the country he'd bled for. And a series of assumptions would catapult him into the kind of spotlight no warrior asks for, one born of judgment and ignorance rather than honor and truth. It began with something small, as it often does, a single call from a concerned citizen who, watching Logan sit quietly on a bench checking coordinates on his phone, misread the heavy-duty bag, the precision in his posture, and the sharp awareness in his eyes as signs of threat, not discipline. Calling the police and reporting a suspicious man, possibly ex-military, looks dangerous, maybe planning something, and within minutes, Officers Briggs and Danner pulled up in a cruiser, eyes already scanning Logan as a potential suspect rather than a civilian minding his business. Stepping out and approaching him with a mix of caution and arrogance, asking loaded questions with their hands near their holsters, treating him like a threat before even learning his name, Logan, as always, remained calm. Offering his identification, immediately his active duty Navy ID, clean, valid, and complete with biometric scan, but the officers waved it off, claiming it looked too polished, accusing him of faking it. And when Logan, trained in de-escalation but not in enduring disrespect passively, told them firmly to verify it properly through federal channels, they took offense, escalating the situation unnecessarily. And when he turned slightly to show he wasn't carrying a weapon, they interpreted it as resistance and lunged, forcing him against the ground, knee on his back, wrenching his arms behind him, and snapping the cuffs on tight enough to leave bruises. Pedestrians looked on, several filming as Logan remained stone-faced and silent, refusing to react emotionally, because that's what years in the SEALs had taught him, to stay calm under pressure, to assess, adapt, and endure, even when wronged. And so he said nothing as they pulled him to his feet, still holding his ID, still ignoring his warnings that they were making a mistake that would haunt them. Inside the precinct, they threw him into a holding room, still cuffed, while they argued over who would run his name, with Briggs insisting he was lying and Danner saying, maybe we should check again, but neither actually doing it properly, assuming that if he were real, someone important would have already called Dan all the while. Logan sat quietly, his breathing slow and steady, staring at the floor, not out of fear, but disappointment. Because this wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, but it was the first time he'd been treated like a criminal in the country he nearly died defending. Minutes turned to an hour, and during that time, a younger officer named Monroe, who had served briefly in the army before becoming a cop, passed by the room and paused. Something about Logan's demeanor, his posture, the unshakable stillness, in how he sat, reminded Monroe of men he'd seen in Afghanistan, men who carried weight the world couldn't see. So he walked into the records room, ran Logan's name through the Department of Defense encrypted clearance system, and was stunned when the screen lit up with a red restricted classified access only warning, followed by a high priority profile. Chief Petty Officer Logan J. Taylor, Tier 1 Operator, SEAL Team 6, Sniper designation confirmed, Bronze Star with Valor, Silver Star, to Navy Commendation Medals, combat tours across the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe, multiple confirmed hostage rescue operations, including one directly saving a U.S. Senator's son from a terrorist compound, and a kill record that was classified. But even without that, his files screamed one thing louder than words. This man was the real deal. A living legend among America's most elite warriors. Monroe's face went pale as he realized the severity of the mistake, and just as he turned to alert his superiors, the precinct's front door opened with a quiet but unmistakable Arthurian, unmarked black SUV had pulled up minutes earlier, and from it stepped General Carter Maddox, 4-star commander of the United States Special Operations Command, flanked by a silent aide and 2 men in plain suits, walking straight through the precinct like a thundercloud in uniform. Every officer, snapping to attention or moving aside as he passed, his face unreadable except for the cold steel in his eyes. Without hesitation, he entered the holding area, walked directly into the room where Logan sat still in cuffs, and the moment Logan saw him, his expression didn't change. He simply said, "Sir," and the general nodded back, replying, "Came as soon as I saw the report," before turning to the officers nearby and demanding, "Who put him in cuffs?" And when no one answered, he raised his voice slightly, not yelling, but enough to slice the air. "This man has bled for this country. You handcuffed a Tier 1 SEAL without even verifying his ID. Do you realize the level of failure that represents?" Then, without waiting for permission, he pulled a key from his pocket, Logan's original team key, kept as a memento, and unlocked the cuffs himself, placing a firm hand on Logan's shoulder, both as a gesture of apology and solidarity, before turning to the officers again and stating, "You owe him more than an apology, you owe him respect." The room fell deathly silent as the reality sank in. The man they'd treated like a threat was a hero more elite than any of them could imagine. Someone who had operated under such secrecy that even their best background checks wouldn't have told the whole story. And now, with the general standing at his side, they understood just how badly they had misjudged a man whose silence wasn't suspicion, it was discipline, whose calm wasn't defiance, it was control, and whose presence on their street wasn't danger, it was protection. And though Logan didn't demand justice or file complaints, the world outside was already reacting. Videos of the arrest had gone viral. Veterans groups were furious, news stations were picking up the footage, and a conversation was beginning to swell across the country. How could this happen to one of our own? How could a man so highly trained, so selfless in service, be profiled and cuffed simply for looking the part of a soldier? And as Logan finally stood up, rubbing his wrists, he didn't speak to shame them, didn't shout or demand retribution. He simply said, "Next time, ask before you judge," and walked out of the room with the general, leaving behind a precinct filled with silence, shame, and the slow realization that their town had just made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. The ride back to the base with General Carter Maddox was quiet, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because both men understood each other beyond words. Logan Taylor, the sniper who had spent years in shadows, and Maddox, the general who had watched young warriors like Logan go into the fire and come back changed, both men shaped by combat, bound by a mutual code of silent respect. And though the general's jaw remained tight and his eyes forward as they drove, in the black SUV with military-grade shielding, his mind was racing through the implications of what had just occurred. A Tier 1 Navy SEAL sniper, one of the most elite marksmen in the history of JSOC, had been thrown to the pavement and handcuffed, like a common criminal, not on foreign soil or in enemy hands, but right here on American streets, by men who didn't even have the discipline to check credentials before letting assumptions dictate action. And while Logan said nothing, sitting still with his hands resting calmly on his thighs, Maddox could see the ghost of something in his expression, not anger, not pride, but something heavier, the look of a man who had served his country in silence, who had protected civilians without thanks, who had eliminated threats most Americans would never hear about, only to come home and be treated like a suspect. And that reality stung more than any wound could. Once they reached the secure entrance of Fort Ainsworth, Logan's current home base, while on assignment in the US, the guards at the gate straightened up in perfect unison, eyes widening as they saw who was in the back seat. Logan's reputation preceded him even within Special Forces circles, and as the vehicle rolled into the compound and parked near the operations wing, Maddox finally broke the silence, saying, "I didn't just come to get you out, I came because I wanted to be the one who showed up for you." And Logan looked at him, finally speaking with his usual calm. "You didn't have to, sir. I didn't expect anyone to." And Maddox shook his head slowly, replying, "That's the damn problem. You should inside the base." Word spread fast Logan was back, and the story of what had happened was already seeping through secure comms and whispered across mess holes and barracks, because the SEALs, Delta guys, Rangers, and Marines all knew that if someone like Logan could be treated like that, none of them were safe from being misjudged. And while Logan tried to go about his debriefs and training quietly, the base commander asked him to speak briefly at a closed assembly, a rare move, but one prompted by the growing unrest in the special operations community, where warfighters were starting to feel that their sacrifices were no longer honored the way they once were. Logan stood in front of the room, just his teammates and high-ranking officers, and recounted the event with no embellishment, no dramatics, just facts. "I showed them my ID, they didn't run it. I told them my name, they ignored it. They saw a quiet man with military gear and assumed I was a threat." And then he paused, looking at the men and women who had fought, bled, and survived beside him for years, continuing, "That's not just about me. That could have been any one of you." The silence that followed was not just one of shock, but of collective clarity. From that moment on, the story began spreading faster than command could contain. Veterans shared their own experiences. Online, active duty members voiced frustration on secure forums. And the video of Logan's arrest, now coupled with leaked footage of General Maddox storming the precinct, had become a viral flashpoint in the public conversation, sparking national news stories titled "Hero in Handcuffs," "Sealed Treated Like a Criminal," and "Do We Respect Our Warriors?" And as media outlets scrambled to get Logan on camera, he refused interviews, declined press, and issued only a brief statement through his commander: "I didn't serve for the attention, I served to protect. I'm still protecting, even now, just in a different way," but the fire had already spread. Meanwhile, back in Falls Glen, the police department was in full damage control. With the mayor issuing a formal apology, an internal affairs investigation launched, and the officers involved placed on administrative leave pending review. Though the public had already reached its verdict, with protests outside City Hall, veterans groups calling for accountability, and a newly emerging question facing the entire country: why are our heroes invisible until they're hurt? And amid the noise, Logan remained silent, returning to training, guiding younger operators on sniper drills, honing his skills as he always had. Though those closest to him noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor, he was still precise, still deadly, still calm, but something in him had been cracked open, not by pain or humiliation, but by the deep ache of knowing that after all he'd given, he could be dismissed with handcuffs by men who never even bothered to ask his name. General Maddox, meanwhile, was pushing through higher levels of the Pentagon, demanding that training be issued to local police departments on how to properly verify military credentials and handle active duty personnel respectfully, calling for reforms while shielding Logan's name from further media exposure. And yet even Maddox couldn't contain what had begun. The story had touched something raw in the American psyche, and soon congressional leaders were discussing it on the floor. Veterans were sharing their own tales of being profiled or dismissed, and Logan, despite never asking for fame, had become the face of a movement he never sought to lead. Back on base, Logan received hundreds of letters from strangers, from schoolchildren to old veterans, each one expressing regret, respect, or deep gratitude. He read them quietly, responding to none, but keeping every single one. And when a father of a fallen SEAL wrote, "You remind me of my son," they didn't see him either until he was gone. Logan wept alone in his barracks for the first time in years, not out of weakness, but from the sheer weight of being seen. As days passed, Logan's fellow operators treated him the same as always, not with celebrity, but with brotherhood, the kind earned only through fire. And though some asked him privately, "What are you going to do about it?" he always replied, "What we've always done: stand guard, keep moving, and lead quietly," because Logan believed deeply that actions, not speeches, defined men like him. And yet even as he moved forward, the world around him was still processing what had happened. Documentaries were already being pitched. The precinct had become the focus of lawsuits, and the officers involved were undergoing federal review. All while Logan kept to his training schedule, spending long nights on the sniper range under moonlight, his eye pressed to the scope, his breath steady, tuning out the chaos beyond the trigger, because that was who he was, a ghost in the shadows, loyal to a country that hadn't always shown loyalty in return, and yet somehow still worth protecting. Eventually, General Maddox met with top brass from the Department of Homeland Security, urging that an interagency awareness protocol be created for identifying and respecting active military personnel in civilian interactions. And while some in Washington dragged their feet, others moved quickly, galvanized by public outrage and a growing demand for change, not just in policy, but in perception. Back in Falls Glen, a group of high school students organized a service and respect day in Logan's honor, laying a folded American flag at the bench where he was first detained, a quiet, symbolic gesture of apology from the next generation to the man who asked for none. And though Logan didn't attend, he heard about it through a Marine on base whose cousin had helped organize Iton. For a brief moment, he smiled, not because justice had been done, but because someone had finally understood the message he never needed to say out loud, that true strength isn't loud, and real heroes don't ask to be noticed, they simply stand their ground, even when no one sees them. Logan Taylor had never asked for legacy. He had lived in the margins of history, never needing his name etched in medals or monuments, because every life he had saved, every team he'd brought home, every bullet he'd placed with surgical precision, was legacy enough for him. But after the incident in Falls Glen, everything had shifted, not because of the moment itself, but because of what it revealed about the fractures within the country he had vowed to protect. And as Chapter 3 of his story unfolded, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the ripple effect of a quiet man being violently misunderstood, and how a nation that prided itself on honoring its warriors had allowed so many of them to be lost in plain sight. Back on Fort Ainsworth, the base had returned to its usual rhythm training drills at dawn, weapons qualifications in the afternoon, classified briefings behind blast-proof walls. But Logan noticed something different in the younger operators, an edge to their questions, a subtle shift in the way they looked at authority. And it wasn't rebellion, was awareness, the realization that the world outside didn't always understand the men behind the uniform, and sometimes saw them, not as protectors but as threats. Logan had no desire to be a symbol, but that didn't mean he could ignore the role the world had handed him. And when his CO approached with a direct request from the Secretary of Defense, an offer for Logan to consult on a nationwide training protocol for law enforcement on veteran interaction and military ID verification, he didn't say no. He said, "If it helps someone else walk free next time, I'll do it." And with that, he was flown to DC under a low-profile call sign, meeting in secure rooms with high-level officials, not to complain or demand, but to educate, drawing on real-world experiences from combat zones and home fronts alike to craft a curriculum that would eventually be rolled out in hundreds of police departments nationwide, not just to prevent mistakes like the one in Falls Glen, but to bridge the growing gap between civilian enforcers and military operators, two groups that should have stood shoulder to shoulder, but had too often ended up on opposite sides of misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the story of Logan Taylor continued to evolve, with media still hungry for commentary, but Logan remaining silent, allowing only his deeds to speak for him, like the quiet donation he made to a struggling veteran transition center in Georgia under a false name, or the anonymous letter he sent to the widow of a fellow SEAL who'd taken his own life, reminding her that his service meant something, even when the world failed to say so. But not everything stayed behind the curtain eventually. A respected retired admiral wrote a detailed op-ed in the New York Times, titled "The Ghost in Handcuffs: What America Did to Logan Taylor," outlining not just the facts of the incident, but the broader cultural failure it represented, and that piece lit a fire under the Department of Veterans Affairs, prompting a re-evaluation of how former and active duty personnel are integrated into community awareness and public safety training, a systemic change triggered by one man's refusal to lash out, and instead to quietly lead through discipline and example. Back in Falls Glen, the consequences of that day had deepened. Officer Briggs resigned after the internal review cited gross procedural neglect, while Officer Danner, the one who had shown brief hesitation during the arrest, requested reassignment to a training unit, hoping to make sure such mistakes wouldn't happen again. Meanwhile, Officer Monrotha, Army vet who had recognized Logan's stillness for what it was quietly promoted and became a liaison to a statewide veteran police outreach initiative, his career now shaped not by the arrest, but by the quiet courage of speaking up when it mattered. Logan never returned to the town, not because of bitterness, but because he knew his presence would make the wrong kind of noise. But he received a letter from a high school civics teacher there, who had begun using his story as a case study in how bias and failure to verify information can lead to irreversible mistakes, and that, more than any medal or commendation, meant something to him. As months passed, Logan continued to serve with the same relentless precision training, leading, watching, but the impact of what had happened followed him like a distant echo, not haunting but ever present, and eventually, the Secretary of Defense invited him to speak off record to a room full of newly promoted generals and colonels about what it means to be invisible in your own country after serving in its darkest hours. And when Logan stood in front of them, dressed in his formal uniform, every ribbon and badge properly placed, he said only this: "We don't ask to be saluted in the street. We don't need parades or applause. But if the systems meant to protect this country treat us like threats, then the threat isn't us, it's the ignorance." And then he stepped down, not waiting for applause, because that wasn't his way. Meanwhile, within the military community, his story became legend, not the viral video, not the news coverage, but the way he carried it all with stoicism, how he remained mission-focused in the face of betrayal, how he turned humiliation into a tool for change without ever seeking revenge or notoriety. Eventually, his CO offered him a rare option, early retirement with honors, a pension upgrade, and a full civilian transition team at his disposal, but Logan turned it down, opting instead to take a new post as a training sniper instructor at a Tier 1 school in the mountains of North Carolina, where young SEAL candidates came to learn from ghosts. And there, in the cold silence of the high ranges, Logan Taylor passed on more than shooting techniques. He taught poise, restraint, the power of silence, and the difference between tactical aggression and disciplined control. All while his name remained mostly out of the public eye, his legend growing not through headlines, but through the whispered reverence of those who trained under him. Years later, after he finally did retire, Logan didn't write a book, didn't start a podcast, didn't take speaking fees or become a face on political posters. Instead, he bought a modest cabin deep in the Appalachian Hills, where he lived quietly, occasionally visiting nearby VA centers to talk one-on-one with veterans, never introducing himself with rank or reputation, just as Logan. And it wasn't until a young former Marine recognized him at one of those visits and posted a photo online with the caption, "This man changed everything and never asked for credit," that the internet remembered him all over again. And while thousands of comments poured in, Logan never replied to a single one, instead sending a handwritten letter to the Marine that said only, "Serve quietly, stand tall, never forget who you are when no one's looking." And perhaps that was the final echo of the day he was handcuffed, not the humiliation, but the legacy of turning shame into service, injustice into reform, and silence into something louder than any speech could ever be. Because Logan Taylor didn't just survive what happened to him, he transformed it. And in doing so, reminded a fractured nation that its quietest warriors are often its strongest, and that respect isn't just owed, it must be practiced.